Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Pocket Lists and Astropad. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hey, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm still thinking about everything that happened at WWDC. It's amazing how much there is to absorb. And last week, we kind of kicked things off with an episode about one of the system apps that is going to get some updates in the fall with iOS 13, which is Notes. It's also getting changes, of course, on Catalina. But today, I thought we would step back a little bit from specific apps and talk about some of the technologies behind the changes that we're going to see. Because while, we don't really get into developer-y type topics on this show very often, the thing is that there were a couple of things announced this year that fundamentally change the way apps are going to be built in the future, really for years and years to come. And I think while we're not going to dive into, the technical details about what this means from a developer standpoint, I think it is useful to go through and talk a little bit about what it means, just kind of from a big picture, how apps are going to change and what this means for the future of, using both iOS devices and the Mac.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this sounds great. And for context, you gonna publish, or you just published today on Mac Stories, an article about this very topic, which is something that you've been thinking about a lot. We've been discussing what used to be known as Marzipan before WWDC, and of course, we were not expecting announcements such as Swift UI at WWDC. But there's a story. So if you're listening to this episode, there's also going to be a story that you can read on macstories.net, which expands upon this discussion. So we thought, for these very special articles, we like to do the episode sort of as a companion material, if you will, to the story. So this is an article from John. It's a really good one. He's been thinking about this one a lot. So go check it out and then listen to the podcast, or maybe listen to the podcast before, then go read the story, whatever you prefer. It's fine for us.
Yeah, there's a lot more detail in the story than I think we'll be able to cover here in 30 minutes. But, there's a lot of nuance to this. I think it does help to kind of talk through some of the issues as well, because Catalyst is something that was on everybody's radar very clearly, because we got the sneak peek in 2018 at WWDC where Craig Federighi got up on stage and explained how Apple was developing technologies to bring iPad apps to the Mac. And in fact, with Mojave, we got 4 Marzipan/Catalyst apps on Mojave. So the thing with those apps, though, is that they weren't really very good. And I think that concerned a lot of people. And that concern has lasted ever since last fall when those apps debuted on the Mac. And so we were expecting to hear more, and we did. The thing that was a little different is that we also heard about Swift UI, which is, in my mind, a longer-term project from Apple. Because what Swift UI basically is, if you think about the part of the apps you see, the user interfaces, it's a way to create those across all different hardware platforms that Apple offers. And to do so in kind of a simple way with one unified tool that allows developers to quickly iterate on the UIs. It's got both the programming language on one side, basically, and a live preview on the other. And you can manipulate either one. You can write code, and it shows up in the UI instantly, or you can manipulate the preview, and it shows up as code instantly. And so it's a way and a tool and more readable code for developers to use to make apps going forward. And I think the first place this is going to have a big impact is with watchOS, because this is basically replacing WatchKit in the long term. But eventually, we're going to see this spread out across all sorts of apps, including all over iOS, the iPad, and the Mac.
What's your take on, there's this sort of this meme or this idea that I've seen on Twitter, I've seen on a bunch of blogs, that even though Catalyst was one of the major new announcements from WWDC 2019, it was launched and immediately deprecated 30 minutes later with the announcement of Swift UI. Do you think there's a valid argument to this idea of Catalyst is coming out now, but it's already old and the future is Swift UI? Sort of, what do you think Apple is trying to do with these two technologies?
Yeah, I don't think that it's dead on arrival. I do think Swift UI is the long-term solution to building UIs, and I don't think those things are necessarily inconsistent, because what I think is happening with Catalyst is that it's a short-term way to realign the iPad and the Mac end of the product line and software at Apple, and that Swift UI is a more global, overarching solution to UI development that's going to be with us for years and really won't take off for quite a few years to come anyway. And the reason that Catalyst then exists kind of within the context of this longer term Swift UI solution, I believe, is because there are problems with both the Mac ecosystem and the iPad ecosystem, and that this Catalyst is designed to address both of those. And I think where, a lot of the debate comes from online that you've seen is that not everybody believes that the Mac is in need of a shot in the arm from the iPad. And I think that a lot of people don't recognize too that part of this solution is about the iPad itself, because look, the iPad has been doing a lot better, I'd say, over the last couple of years with the iPad Pro. The hardware is now enabling the kind of pro level apps that we've wanted for a long time, but have been kind of few and far between. But it's still a relatively limited set of pro tools on the iPad. And what this will do, I think, and we'll get into the details a little bit more in a minute, I think it will encourage, because the idea is to be able to bring iPad apps to the Mac. It'll encourage iPad apps to kind of take on those new and interesting and pro level features, because those will translate directly into what you can do with a Mac app.
Mm-hmm. It feels to me as if in this whole debate of whether should iPad developers sort of also become Mac app developers because the Mac is in need of that kind of app ecosystem, it feels to me as if longtime Mac users, they recognize that the Mac has a problem, in that we've seen the rise of Electron apps, we've seen, Slack and apps like GitHub and all of these cross-platform apps that work, but they're not Mac-like, or they're not good Mac citizens in the context of they don't use native UI elements, they don't follow certain Mac interaction guidelines, they are not well engineered because they use too much computing power, too much memory. They don't perform as well as a native Mac app would. So these people, they recognize that there's an issue. But the moment that Apple provided a potential solution, I'm seeing a lot of rejection to this idea of maybe we should use UIKit. Maybe instead of trying something else and trying to push AppKit, we should maybe just use the stronger app ecosystem that we already have and let iPad developers also make apps for the Mac. And instead, what I'm seeing is that at least a few folks on Twitter and on other blogs, they recognize the problem, but to them, the only solution is this idealized state of everybody should just be making AppKit versions of their Mac clients. And that's just not happening. For as much as in an ideal state, that would be the best solution, maybe, to have, as it used to be, native UIKit apps on iOS and native AppKit apps on the Mac. I guess for a lot of companies, it's just a matter of priorities, and the installed base of the Mac just doesn't justify making a Mac version of their apps. Or maybe the fact that AppKit is an older set of technologies, and maybe you can make the case that UIKit is more intuitive to use for developers, is more modern, is fresh, it's a fresh start. Developers just don't want to make AppKit apps anymore. And so I guess what the real challenge here will be to convince developers that their iPad apps can make for valid Mac apps as well, but also to convince that these long-time Mac users, which are, they've been advocates of the Mac platform, and some of them, they have podcasts, they have blogs, they have websites where they share these opinions. And, for the Mac community, which I think it's a really strong community still in 2019, to convince these long-time Mac users that these are not like foreign apps to be rejected, but the Catalyst apps are real Mac apps. And that would be the challenge, I think, on two fronts for Apple to convince developers and to convince the community, which I really don't think I've ever seen this kind of divide between, within the Apple community, between iOS developers and Mac developers, or iOS users and Mac users. This whole discussion about Catalyst is really showing the kind of differences that I guess I knew they were like under the surface, waiting to bubble up after WWDC. But it's really fascinating, in a strange way, to observe the kind of opinions that some people have, and this difference of ideas and on what they think about the iPad and what they think about the Mac.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pocket Lists. Pocket Lists delivers the world's friendliest to-do list experience, period. How do they do that? Well, it all starts with the user interface and specifically making collaboration and sharing drop dead simple. Who said to-do lists have to be boring, lifeless lists, drained of color and fun? Pocket Lists sure didn't, because they know that giving users over 400 icons for lists, over 70 built-in or custom cover images, and color coding to make their lists look better also makes them easier to use. Setting due dates is super simple too, because Pocket Lists supports natural language for dates and times in all 10 languages that the app supports. Sharing and collaboration is just as simple too. It's as easy as sharing a link. And Cloud Sync and backups are free too, so you can always have your to-do lists with you and rest easy knowing that they're backed up. There's even an option for private Cloud Sync. The latest release, which just came out, has a dark mode too, which looks absolutely fantastic. The app has a bunch of other features too, like reminders that can be set on a particular date, time, location, or as repeating reminders. There's also hashtags, subtasks, and a whole lot more. There's even an Apple Watch app and an iMessage app. Here's the thing. Apple's Reminder app works, but it's pretty basic. Pocket Lists has been doing a lot of the things Reminders has done for years, even some of the stuff that's coming up in iOS 13. But Pocket Lists does a whole lot more too. So check it out today at pocketlists.com. Again, that's pocketlists.com for the world's friendliest to-do list. Our thanks to Pocket Lists for supporting App Stories. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, first of all, though, I think it's important to kind of note for people who maybe don't understand the underlying technologies as much is that Catalyst is, in fact, does create native apps, right? I mean, It is using the frameworks and the APIs of underlying AppKit and UIKit. It's absolutely native. It's not like Electron, where it's basically a wrapper around some web technologies.
Yeah,
there's a big difference kind of right there. And I think where some of this comes from, and I mean, look, I live in both camps. I work a lot every single day on my Mac, but also on my iPad. And I've adapted to the Mac. I recognize that there's a problem with the Mac, but I'm still getting my work done on the Mac. It's not like we're in a state of absolute crisis where the Mac is on the way out the door and it's going to die. I mean, that's not the case at all. And there are good examples of apps that cross both iOS and the Mac. Things like Things and Ulysses and iWriter and MindNode. Those are all great apps. And they all are on both platforms, but those are the exceptions to the rule. The reality is that, I mean, we're covering apps every single day at Mac Stories, and we see all the new apps coming out. We see the apps that we don't necessarily even use ourselves. We get, I think, a very good broad-based picture of what's going on both platforms. And the volume of new and interesting Mac apps that we see come across our desks is really tiny compared to iOS. It's really quite a bit smaller. Now, what I've done is I've found ways to get my work done, as I said, on the Mac over the years, but it's not ideal. And, all you have to do is look at things like the ADAs this year, for instance, right? There were no Mac apps. There were no Mac apps at all. There was one game. There was In Between Gardens, I think it's called. And it is also on iOS. It started on the Mac, though, and it's on iOS, but there were no productivity apps or of any kind in the ADAs this year, which is a shame. And another aspect, I guess, of this controversy, if you want to call it, this debate, is the notion that there's nothing that the iPad has to offer to the Mac beyond games and entertainment apps. Things like a Netflix app, for instance, or any game that might be on iOS that's not on the Mac. And I think that's just wrong. I mean, one of the first things I did when I set out to write this article was I sat down and I went through my iPad and and I looked at all the apps I have, and I found like 60 that I could have thrown into this article that I wish were on the Mac, and they're not. Don't worry, I didn't put all 60 in the article. That would have been an awfully long list and kind of boring to read, but I did pull out, some categories to talk about in particular, because there are things that I do every single day that even when I'm sitting in front of my Mac, I'll pick up my phone or my iPad and do them on my iPad and then switch back to the Mac. And I don't want to do that. What I want to be able to do is choose what platform I get my work done on, not be forced to go to a particular platform. And maybe that's a little bit of a nuanced distinction, but I want to make the choice, not have the platform make the choice for me. So if I'm at my Mac, I can do anything with these same apps that I use on my iPad. But if I'm at my iPad, I can do the exact same thing without having to, run off to my Mac to get something done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels to me as if to see this problem of there are no new apps on the Mac, you have to be in the mindset of, I want to try new software.
Right.
I want to try new apps, because I think there's an overlap between folks who think the Catalyst is the worst thing to happen to the Mac ecosystem in decades, and folks who have been using the same apps for 20 years. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using BBEdit and Safari and Mail and Tweetbot, and that's it, right? If you want to use those apps and you don't care about anything else, I think it's perfectly fair that your first reaction to Catalyst would be, I don't like this, because it means that maybe they're going to take my apps away or something. Like, I could see how the first reaction could be that. And maybe you shouldn't take us at Mac Stories as the ideal Mac user, because we try lots of apps for a living. It's our job to experiment with apps, to switch between apps, to download and buy new apps all the time. But I don't think it's uncommon for any kind of person who is not a tech blogger to want to try new software, to want to try new apps. Otherwise, why are developers making them? Otherwise, why do we even have an app store if it's not to try and solve new problems, try and make new solutions for workflows and new ways of getting work done and new ways to be entertained that people come up with in 2019 and all the time. So
right,
I think, and from that point of view, it's only obvious that the Mac is not getting any of these new apps. Like, we see it firsthand with all the emails and all the the developer pitches that we get at Mac Stories. We just don't see the same numbers between the iOS App Store and the Mac App Store, or just developers who are selling Mac apps on their websites. They're just not there. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with saying we want to take the same experiences that we have on iPad and rethink them, refine them, bring them to the Mac, add those finishing touches that make for a fantastic Mac experience, but allow Mac users, students who just bought a MacBook, for example, or just the average user who has a MacBook Air, for instance, and wonders, why don't I have the same apps that I know from my iPhone and from my iPad? Why don't I have the same apps on my Mac? That's just not a good experience. It's not a good look for Apple to say, well, when you're on your iPhone or your iPad, you can download all of these amazing apps on the App Store. But then if you buy a Mac, it's almost like a punishment. Like, you open the App Store and you find none of those apps. That's not a good look for the company. That's not a good experience for users. And so from that point of view, if you only need to use the same 10 apps that have been around on macOS for 20 years, fine. But it's not like every single Mac user has the same needs and has the same history and has the same tradition. There are new Mac users every day. New Mac users
right.
are born every day. And
yes, they are.
Those users deserve to use the same software and to have the same capabilities as someone who's using an iPad. Like, it's just as simple as that.
And I think too, Federico, that those new Mac users are probably these days more likely to be coming from iOS first,
Exactly.
too, right? Because
Yes.
I just think of my kids who, growing up before they had a Mac, they all have Macs now. They started on an iPod Touch or an iPad or an
Hmm.
iPhone in high school, and then they went off to college. And we got them a MacBook Air. So yeah,
Exactly.
that's a very different experience than someone like myself who had a Mac before I had iOS. I mean, that's a very different perspective. Both of them are totally legitimate and valid. It's just that I think what Apple's recognizing is that if the Mac is going to continue to grow and be a viable platform going forward, they just have to address these people who are coming at it from an entirely different perspective and experience. And so that's what they're doing with Catalyst, I think.
Yeah. So, do you want to call out some of these apps that you mentioned in your story, iPad apps that you would like to see on the Mac?
Yeah, one of the things that I've thought about, first of all, is pretty obvious, and that's writing apps. And,
Mhm.
one category where I think the Mac is still very strong is with text editors. I mean, there are a lot of choices out there. There are some, like OneWriter, for instance, which I don't believe is on the Mac. But by and large, a lot of the really big names that you would know of, things like Ulysses and IA Writer and others are already on the Mac. But there are a lot of other tools that I use every day when I'm writing that I don't have. I mean, one app that came to mind almost immediately is Christian Selig's Apollo Reddit client, because Reddit's a great place to go get little tidbits of information and do research. And there are Reddit clients that you can get on the Mac App Store. I have never found one that looked even remotely as good as Apollo. So that's one. Another is dictionary app. I mean, the Mac has a built-in dictionary app, and it's fine, but I prefer Terminology from Agile Tortoise or Lookup. Those are both great dictionary apps that I use every day on my iPad that I have no access to on the Mac. Another one that you and I use a lot, I mean, it's really a developer tool, is Working Copy. Working Copy is a Git client, and when I'm at my Mac, I'm stuck using the Electron app, GitHub Desktop, and it gets the job done. It's just not as polished. It's not as good. Doesn't have as many features as Working Copy. And I would love to see that app come to the Mac. It is a powerful Git client that any developer or someone doing what we're doing, which is collaborating on Markdown files, could use on the Mac. And I'd like to not have to context switch and use different apps on both platforms there.
Mhm.
Of course, there's Timery, our time tracking app
Right.
for Toggle. That one is a big one because when I'm on my Mac, I'm using a Fluid browser instance with the Toggle web page running in it, which is fine. But again, it's not nearly as polished or good as Timery itself. Then I'm not going to go through every single app, but RSS clients is a big one for me because there are so many good ones on iOS and there's virtually none on the Mac. It's not that there aren't any on the Mac, but there aren't very many that are on both the Mac and iOS for some reason. I mean, Reader is an exception right there, but Reader doesn't have the best history in terms of getting updates or having power user features of the sort you find on iOS, like with Fiery Feeds or Lear or something like that. You just don't get those on the Mac. And then probably the single biggest category, one that I don't use so much for things I do for Mac stories, but that I do enjoy using just personally, are things like audio, video, and photography apps. There are tons of these on iOS, really good ones. Things like LumaFusion and Darkroom, Best Photos, and then there's Fairlight for editing audio. Those are all apps that aren't on the Mac, and they're really very good on the iPad. And I wish they were there. And the only other thing I guess I would mention are a whole bunch of different little utilities that just make life easier on the iPad every day. Things like Linky for linking articles that we write, or grocery. I'm not going to haul my Mac to the grocery store when I'm grocery shopping, but if I had grocery on my Mac and I've got my hands on the keyboard and I thought of something that we need at the store, I could type it in really fast, or I could use dictation or something like that, or Calzones for example. I mean, David Smith's recent app for coordinating meetings and times with people in other time zones. That's a fantastic app that I use a lot on my iPhone and on my iPad, but it's just not available on the Mac either, where I'm just as likely to be scheduling something with you or someone else. And
Right.
the list just keeps going on and on
Yeah.
and on. And I'd love to, have all these apps that I use every day on my iPad available when I'm working on my Mac too.
Yeah, and I guess even just these few examples, they really show how the idea of Catalyst is only good for games and entertainment apps, it doesn't really hold much truth when you consider the vast ecosystem of productivity tools and utilities that you have on the iPad App Store. And if Apple ever allows this even on the iPhone App Store, the rumor says that next year Catalyst will probably add support for iPhone apps, but still this notion that the iOS App Store is only good for small utilities and toy apps like games and video streaming apps, I fundamentally disagree with this idea. Because, the iPad is my main computer. We all know this story. We all know how many millions of people are now using an iPad Pro as their primary or only computer. And so why shouldn't I have the same app ecosystem, the same experiences that I have on my iPad on my Mac? And why is part of the Apple community so fundamentally and opposed to the idea, maybe emotionally invested in not liking Catalyst, which is also, I guess, another part of this discussion of Catalyst pushes all the buttons in certain segments of the Apple community in terms of the iPad as the future is now coming to take our Mac apps away. I don't think that's happening at all. Existing Mac apps will continue to exist, and nobody's taking away your BB Edit or Transmit from Panic. I guess all these apps will remain. But wouldn't it be nice to also have more choice? And as your examples show, there's plenty of choice. There's plenty of options that could be coming to the Mac.
Yeah, there really is. And, I think, too, it was very clear in Apple's messaging at WWDC that they don't expect people to turn their AppKit Mac apps into Catalyst apps. They've came right out and said, if you've got an app on the Mac that you're developing and is a solid app and you're updating it, you don't have to do anything. We're not telling you should move to Catalyst. We're encouraging developers who have an iPad app but not a Mac app, or maybe people who have a Mac app that's not been updated in a long time because the company making it just didn't have the resources to commit to the Mac too, for them to consider using Catalyst. I do want to switch gears really briefly, Federico, and talk a little bit about what this means to the iPad too, because sure. I think that's a piece of this that gets lost in this debate a lot, which is, I said a little bit at the top that it's taken quite a while for truly pro apps to flourish on the iPad. And it seems as though that's on the upswing to me from what I've seen looking at the full app ecosystem. But this, I think, Catalyst is also designed to help encourage that too, and to maybe accelerate the pace of those apps, because different features that are being introduced with iPad OS, if those are adopted by developers, then they're going to give them a lot of the functionality that they're going to need to bring that app over to the Mac as well. And I see it as a virtuous cycle, really, because if you're already got an iPad app, if you adopt those iPad OS 13 features, you'll automatically have that much more of a head start when you decide to make a Mac app. And if you decide to make a Mac app, now you've just opened yourself up to a whole new bunch of people who might be willing to buy your app. And it just kind of feeds on itself. I think, there are things like dark mode and the windowing and all those things which directly translate to the Mac.
Yeah. And if you want to make a great Mac app, as a result, you will have to make a great iPad app, which I think this is great for everybody involved. So yeah, absolutely. This is something that I'm super excited to see. Sort of developers who are in the process of considering Catalyst versions of their apps. What kind of improvements will they make to their iPad apps? Because the iPad version will be the foundation of the Catalyst app. And so
right.
I will get a better iPad app and I will also get a Mac version. So it's really the best of both worlds for people like me, at least.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Astropad Studio. Astropad Studio turns your iPad into a completely customizable graphics tablet so you can combine the power of the Apple Pencil with your favorite Mac apps right on your iPad. The makers behind Astropad understand that no two artists work alike. That's why they've packed Astropad with opportunities to customize every aspect of your workflow with features like programmable gestures, custom pressure curves, and unlimited per app shortcuts. They literally designed Astropad from the ground up for professional artists, and they guarantee low latency performance over Wi-Fi or a USB cable so you can set up your workspace on the go. It's a high performance tool for the most demanding creative work, and it's used by major animation studios and product design firms across the globe. So, if you're ready to take your creative workflow to the next level, you can start with your free 30-day trial of Astropad Studio today by visiting astropad.com to get started. Again, that URL, it's astropad.com. Go check it out. Our thanks to Astropad Studio for their support of App Stories.
Can you go over some of the problems that you outlined in the story when it comes to Catalyst?
Yeah, there are a couple of things, and there are definitely things I think that people should be concerned about and that Apple, I think, has to work through. One is, as I also mentioned at the top, the Mojave Catalyst apps weren't very good. And I think that that's where an awful lot of this angst and concern has come from. Now, just last week, there was an interview that Craig Federighi did with CNET where he came out and said for the first time that those apps are going to be updated and revised when the public beta comes out for Catalina. Now, I know when you interviewed Craig, he told you that a lot of those things that people were upset about were design decisions and not technological Catalyst decisions. And I think I think he echoed that during the talk show live at WWC too. And it feels like that message didn't maybe get the traction that Apple was hoping it would, because people were still, I think, a little shocked when they saw the betas, both beta 1 and 2, with the 4 Catalyst apps with virtually no changes to them. And so, it's been over a year, not over a year, it's been since last fall that we've had those apps, and they haven't really changed at all, despite what I think is pretty common knowledge that there are problems with them. So that's a concern, and I guess we'll see when the public beta comes out to what degree those things are fixed. We also haven't seen a lot of new Catalyst apps. I mean, we got podcasts, and I guess Find My is also a Catalyst app from what I've been able to gather. And those apps, I mean, podcasts is clearly a much higher quality Catalyst app than any of the ones we saw from Mojave. It's not entirely clear whether all of the technologies and techniques that are being used to make that look more like a traditional Mac app are going to be available to third parties or not. There's some indication that they're doing some things. I know Steve Troughton-Smith has been digging into this, that Apple's doing some things with that app that are very much unique to that app and aren't necessarily public yet. But I guess we'll see with that as well. The second thing that is worth mentioning is a business plan issue.
Right.
Which is, and this is really a big one, I think, because for this to be an improvement over the current situation with Mac apps, I think that developers need to have as much flexibility as possible for coming up with a business plan that works with their existing apps. So, if you do an iOS app right now, you can create a universal app so that with one download and one payment or one subscription, you get the iPad version, the iOS version, and the watchOS version, and even, I guess, the tvOS version. That's what a universal app is. And you can have a single in-app purchase that kind of works and spans all those different versions of your app. But you can't do that with a Catalyst app. So if you have an iPad app and you bring it over to the Mac with Catalyst, it's considered a separate app. It's not going to be part of a universal app at all. And that requires developers to jump through some hoops in order to kind of put them together as a package. First of all, there are no bundles with macOS, and there never have been, which has always been a little baffling to me and would solve some of these problems. But if you have a subscription or an in-app purchase, the only way to kind of tie those back to your iOS app is to run your own separate server and validate receipts for those apps and coordinate that server side. And that's complicated. It requires the cost of a server, and it requires the collection of user data, which some developers don't want to do. It would be a lot simpler if Apple built this solution right in and allowed those developers to make one universal app that included the Mac app. Because instead, what's going to happen now is that developers will have to charge separately for that Mac app, which great if you have a business model that supports that sort of thing and you can charge separately. But if you don't, your users are just going to be unhappy.
Yeah, and I guess that Apple was not targeting the universal approach for this year. It feels like a 2020 thing, but I'm really surprised that I think they should have done it sooner. I think it would be an ideal solution for some developers to be able to say the App Store service takes care of sharing in-app purchases or sharing subscriptions. I don't want to deal with running my own server or having to sort of retrofit license validation, for example, using iCloud, which is a long workaround and a long hack that some developers do, but it's prone to break. For instance, if the user disables iCloud in settings, that's not an ideal situation. You want to make sure that you can share those receipts using a server that is always running. But that, as you mentioned, that entails collecting user data to some extent, which is not ideal for GDPR. So there should really be, the developers should have the choice of saying, I want to share my in-app purchases, my subscriptions, or my paid upfront apps, and I want to make sure that people can just buy the app once and use it everywhere, or I want to choose to let them pay multiple times. That should be a service that the App Store, that Apple offers, but it's not possible yet. And I'm still hoping that Apple will maybe change its mind and roll it out, by the end of the year. But it doesn't feel like it. It feels like a major announcement that they're probably saving for WWDC 2020 and have sessions about it, have labs to ask questions to App Store people. So I wouldn't hold hope for September and Apple to change its mind here. So where does this whole discussion leave us, John?
Well, I think you're right about the business models, by the way. I mean, that it's unfortunate because I think that creates friction, which will slow down adoption. But even with those issues, I'm overall optimistic about Catalyst. I think that it's the right direction for the Mac. I also think it's the right direction for the iPad. Like it or not, I think the Mac and the iPad, their futures are now tied together to some degree. They're going to be, I think what Apple's trying to do is make it easy for developers to develop for both platforms, but also respect the differences of the two devices and how they're used. And that's a tricky balance. And I think it's going to be messy at times over the next few years. And they're not going to get it right away. I mean, even though this is a shorter term project, I think, overall than something like Swift UI, it's still not something that's going to be done with one OS release. We're going to get partway there in the fall. But I think, as you pointed out with the business plans, there are pieces of this that are probably not going to come until 2020 and maybe beyond that. But I think overall, there is an opportunity here, especially for developers who are working on pro-level iPad apps, to not only improve their iPad apps through this process, but open up an entirely new set of customers who can buy their app and in the process make the entire use of the Mac a better experience for everybody. All right, Federico. Well, it'll be really interesting to see how this just wraps up over the next few years. I'm really excited about it. I feel like the debate is a good debate to be having, and it's going to help push this forward, I hope. I just hope that people don't, dig their heels in too far on some of the issues. In any event, I want to thank our two sponsors for today's episode. That's Pocket Lists and Astropad. You can, of course, find me and Federico over at macstories.net, where you will also find the story that I wrote about Catalyst and Swift UI. Federico is also on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.